Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about when training minimalism goes too far. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, I am known for promoting what a lot of people consider to be training minimalism, meaning telling people you don't need to do more exercises than is necessary to reach your goal. And I say that because not because I want people to do less total training volume or less lifting, but because too much exercise variation requires too many adaptations, and it can slow down your progress on the lifts that you care about the most. In other words, if you're doing 6 different types of chest presses, your bench press and your weighted dip that might be the ones you care about the most are going to go up slower. You're going to get less progressive overload, less overall development. But by that same token, I think people need a well-rounded strength base and a well-rounded muscle base. So when I talk about training minimalism, what I generally mean is that most people in any given week, barring some sort of peaking for a bodybuilding or physique type endeavor, and again, and I don't mean your off season, I mean peaking, you probably don't need to focus on more than about 6 or 7, maybe 8 exercises in any given week. And if you need more variation than that, you probably need to rotate something in for a few weeks to work on a weak point or whatever. And I think the other problem we have, though, is that people hear this minimalist approach, and I discuss getting the most bang for your buck out of every exercise, and then what do people do? They start asking about routines that only have 3 or 4 lifts. Now, that might work for some people who are Olympic lifters or something, but you need to keep in mind, Olympic lifters do complex exercises, and oftentimes they do separate training to break those into movement patterns. I know some Olympic lifters. I've seen some of them train. I have an idea of what they do. They don't just do a snatch. They practice overhead squats. They practice snatching off of blocks. They break these movements into different patterns and actually practice the individual patterns. They'll practice power cleans. They'll practice like a clean style deadlift. They'll practice their jerk separate. They'll do strict overhead pressing. You see them do a lot of different things that build into those exercises. But for everyone else, I think the problem we run into is that I'll mention this. And for example, yesterday I had someone say, hey, could a person develop a good physique, a well-rounded musculature and base if they did nothing but weighted dips, weighted chin-ups, squats, and deadlifts? And I think that's going a little too far the other direction. And I do want to break down why, but keep in mind there are other people out there. Like I've said, you have guys like Martin Berkham, you have the Golden One, some of these guys, these Swedish guys who have extremely impressive physiques. They are very strong guys who say, really, you just need to focus on about 5 exercises. And they basically use very similar 5 exercises. But people then get the impression that they don't do any variation, and that's not always the case. And I tell people, novice lifters don't need much variation. Yeah, I could pick a handful of exercises and get a novice to get all their noob gains out of those. It can absolutely easily be done. But the problem we run into when we start going down to 3 or 4, I think that's a problem, because as I've said in the past, you have 6 basic movement patterns. You have 6 basic movement patterns that are your full body movements overall, as far as the things the body's meant to do. And I've told people you want to do some sort of squat, some sort of hip hinge, a vertical press, vertical pull, horizontal pull. That's your 6 minimum. So if you don't have a basic compound exercise in your overall routine for each of those movement patterns, I think you're selling yourself short. And you're not just selling yourself short in terms of muscular development, because to be quite honest, I've seen people who get really good development sometimes with fewer exercises than you might think, who actually skip some of those patterns. But the problem we run into is that I think that it leads to a higher chance of weakness, and I think it has or a higher chance of injury, because you have a basic movement pattern that's not there, and it can lead to strength imbalances. I mean, perfect example, I've actually met bodybuilders, a perfect example, again, drugs are in the mix, who don't do any delt work, like you would think of as traditional delt work. They don't do any lateral raises, they don't do any overhead pressing, and they still have enormous delts. because of, again, the combination of their genetics, drugs, and the fact that they do a ton of chest pressing and a ton of pulling, they end up having complete and full shoulder development. Like I met a guy a while back who was like that at a gym. Actually, at that gym I used to film at last year. I met a bodybuilder, younger NPC kid, was chatting with him about his training. He loved doing deadlifts. He did a lot of deadlifts. He did a lot of pull-ups, rows, a lot of chest presses. He did a lot of bench press. He did a lot of weighted dips, but mostly bench pressing. He had complete shoulder development. You would think the guy did 20 sets of side lateral raises every single week. But he didn't. But the thing that you run into there is that you might end up with good development in areas, but you're going to have a strength deficiency. You're going to have a strength deficiency through some of these movement patterns. And in my experience, you're going to have a higher chance of injury rate when you start doing other physical endeavors. And people who can have a good strength base through a variety of joint angles, who have good mobility, who are at least strong in one exercise out of those 6 basic movement patterns, are just less likely to get hurt. Furthermore, sometimes some variations, instead of just doing your 3 or 4 exercises, can actually improve your performance. Because sometimes we stagnate, sometimes we plateau, and rotating in a similar movement pattern exercise can bring up muscle deficiencies. It can help bring up weak points in your actual strength curve and your performance. And it can cut down the chances of overuse injuries, because that is the one problem we do run into sometimes, and this is not true of all exercises. Exercises that load oftentimes muscles across the most joints, the injury rate's relatively low even when you do enormous amounts of volume. You don't get overuse injuries. It's easy because they get dispersed more. But the less joints and the less muscles that get involved in an exercise, the higher the chance of overuse injuries, sometimes from doing it too much. So a little bit of variation helps. Meaning something like a low bar squat, perfect example, it's very hard to get overuse injuries from it, but you can overtrain from it. So we kind of come back to that point of a little bit of exercise variation can help with overuse injuries. And I don't mean that you need to have them all the time. I'd still go back to that point. You can do 6 or 7 exercises every week, but at a certain point you might need to rotate some stuff in for a few weeks. Maybe your bench press is stagnating a bit, your normal flat bench, so you go to close grip or a weighted dip or a floor press for 3 weeks is a perfect example of what I mean. And sometimes that'll help with some of the inflammation you're getting. Maybe it works the tendon slightly differently. It can help with inflammation that can eventually turn into overuse injuries. It can help bring up some deficiencies as far as strength somewhere in your strength curve. So that's what we mean by a little bit of variation. But when we come back to the point of what should you be doing on a weekly basis, I think you generally need those 6 movement patterns. The only point we get into some ambiguity is that there are complex exercises that can in some cases partially fulfill the other roles. Like I would tell people, power clean is a hip hinge, right? It's a hip hinge. But is it also a vertical pull? Partially. It's not as good of a vertical pull as, say, a row. But if a person were to be doing a lot of power cleans and a lot of chin-ups, could they hypothetically replace their hip hinge and vertical pull with that? Yeah, they possibly could. So there might be some exceptions there, or someone does a clean and push press or a clean and jerk. How much of their overhead press is that fulfilling for them? Arguable, arguable. But by that same token, a lot of these complex lifts, the people who really master them, oftentimes break them down into separate movements sometimes also. So again, that's where we start throwing a degree of complexity in when we start adding exercises that have more than one movement through them, right? Because a power clean has 2 different pulls. But the majority of the lifts that you guys are out there doing, they really are only one movement pattern. I mean, a barbell squat is one movement pattern. A bench press is one movement pattern. You have one bar path. So that's a little bit different, and you got to keep that in mind. And so you really need, in my opinion, a minimum of 6 exercises every single week. For a lot of people, I think 7 can be better. And yeah, you can focus on those because you can get really strong on a weekly basis at 6 to 7 exercises, cover all your basic movement patterns, and have one more lift in there that might bring up a deficiency that you have at any given time, and then it allows you to rotate stuff through. So I think my issue I run into with people who are like, well, I'm only doing 3 or 4 exercises a week. I think in the long term, while you can actually get a lot of size and strength doing that, actually you can very easily get big and strong doing that than you can with a lot of what other people do. But you need to keep in mind you can develop strength deficiencies, you can develop muscle imbalances, and really set yourself up for injury in the long term. And it's just something you got to keep in mind with that. And I think that's when training minimalism goes a little bit too far. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.